The cliff edge was slick with salt and spray. Cami stood where the earth simply stopped, staring into the gray expanse where the sky bled into the sea. Each gust of wind pulled at her, a constant, hollow thudding that drowned out the world behind her. Luca was already on the deck of his boat, the snap of canvas and the metallic clatter of rigging cutting through the roar of the surf. He moved with a practiced, steady efficiency, ignoring the mainland that loomed behind them like a fading memory. Cami watched him work, her fingers tracing the rough stone of the cliff wall. She felt the vibration of the boat engine starting a low, guttural hum that signaled the end of her hesitation, and the wind was now pulling her toward the horizon. She took a final breath of the brine-heavy air, turned her back on the house, and began the long, steep descent toward the dock. The memory arrived with the bite of winter. 10 years ago, the lake was a sheet of black glass under a failing sun. Cami had been walking the shore when the ice groaned, a sound like cracking timber, and then the splash. She did not hesitate. She dove into the water, the cold hitting her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. She pushed through the slush, her hands searching the dark, liquid void until they locked onto his collar. Jason was sinking, his eyes wide and unseeing in the freezing depths. She hauled him upward, every muscle in her body screaming as she fought the weight of his deadlocked limbs and the numbing drag of the ice. She dragged him onto the frozen bank, gasping, her own skin burning from the rapid drop in temperature. She pressed her palms against his chest, forcing the water from his lungs until he finally bucked and gasped for air. In that silence, huddled on the frost-covered grass, the bond was forged. He had looked at her then, blinking against the biting wind, and she had known he would never be adrift again. She had anchored him to the living world, a debt he had spent a decade slowly forgetting. The living room was quiet, the air thick with the smell of floor wax and stale coffee. Jason sat by the window, his gaze focused on the driveway. Then, the sound began. A sharp, rhythmic clicking against the hardwood floor. It started in the hallway, precise and measured, echoing through the empty space. It was a sound that did not belong in this house. Cami stood by the kitchen island, her hands resting on the granite, listening as the rhythm drew closer. Each step was deliberate, a metallic tap that seemed to demand space. The front door opened and closed with a soft thud. Alana walked into the frame, her movement fluid, cutting through the stagnant atmosphere of the room. She stopped in the center of the living area, her presence immediately shifting the balance of the space. Jason rose from his chair, the wood scraping harshly against the floor as he pushed it back. He did not look toward the kitchen. He did not acknowledge the person who had pulled him from the ice years ago. His focus narrowed, locking onto the visitor as if the rest of the room had simply ceased to exist. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the faint, lingering echo of those persistent steps. Jason turned his back to the kitchen, his posture shifting into a lean toward the woman standing before him. He did not glance toward the island. He did not check if Cami was still in the room. His focus remained fixed on Alana, his eyes tracking her every movement as if the house had shrunk to contain only the two of them. He walked past the dining table, his shoulder brushing against the edge, and reached into the small bowl by the entryway. He pulled out a heavy metal ring. The keys caught the overhead light, glinting as he held them out. He stepped closer to Alana, closing the gap until he stood within her personal space, effectively blocking any view of the hallway behind him. He placed the keys into her palm, his fingers lingering against hers for a second longer than necessary. He gestured toward the far end of the hall, toward the guest suite that had sat empty for months. Alana nodded, her expression unreadable, and took the keys. Jason smiled, a quick, sharp movement of his lips that never reached his eyes. He turned his attention back to her, leaving the rest of the house in a sudden, suffocating stillness. Cami remained in the shadows of the hallway, her spine pressed against the doorframe. She did not lean forward or step into the light. She watched the exchange, her breathing steady and rhythmic. Her pulse did not spike. Her hands remained loose at her sides, fingers uncurled. She tracked the way Jason gestured toward the guest suite, the way the metal keys disappeared into Alana's palm, and the specific angle of his head as he leaned in. Every movement was a confirmation. The air in the hallway felt thin, yet she did not gasp. She did not squeeze her eyes shut to hold back tears. Instead, she stared. She watched the scene until the details etched themselves into her mind, the weight of his posture, the lack of hesitation, the finality of the keys changing hands. A cold, hard clarity began to settle over her, replacing the static tension of the last hour. She did not need to speak. She did not need to ask for an explanation. The silence between them was no longer a void. It was a wall. She turned her back to the living room, her boots making no sound on the runner as she moved toward the study. The choice was made. The transition was complete. Cami reached the study and pushed the heavy door shut until the latch clicked. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the street lamp filtering through the blinds. She walked to the central desk, her hands finding the familiar mahogany grain. She pulled the bottom drawer open, the metal sliders groaning in the quiet. From beneath a stack of old files, she withdrew a heavy envelope. She placed it on the blotter, the sound sharp and final. She pulled the documents out, the paper sliding against the wood with a rhythmic rasp. Her fingers traced the lines of text, identifying the signature block at the bottom of the final page. She pulled a fountain pen from the stand, unscrewed the cap, and felt the weight of the metal in her grip. She paused, the tip of the nib hovering an inch above the designated line. She did not tremble. She did not look toward the living room. She pressed the nib down, the ink bleeding into the fiber of the page as she formed the letters of her name. 1 stroke, 2, 3. She set the pen down, aligned the stack of papers with the edge of the desk, and turned toward the window. The decision was no longer a thought. It was a physical fact. Morning light cut across the kitchen, sharp and unforgiving. The marble counter was cold under the weight of the document stack. It sat there, a white, angular obstruction against the dark stone surface. Jason walked in, humming to himself, his mind occupied by the previous night. He stopped when he saw the papers. He leaned in, squinting, then picked them up. He let out a short, sharp laugh, the sound echoing against the tile walls. He shook his head, tossing the pages back down with a dismissive flick of his wrist. It was a stunt, a theatrical display of frustration meant to grab his attention. He walked to the coffee machine, his movements loose and careless, not bothering to check the bedrooms or the closet. He assumed the house was still anchored to his presence. He poured a cup of coffee, the steam rising in the morning air, and turned back to the kitchen island. He tapped the edge of the papers with his spoon, waiting for a reaction that would never come. The silence of the house was absolute. He checked his watch, impatient for the day to start, never noticing that the silence was not a pause, but an ending. Cami stood in the center of the bedroom, the silence of the house pressing in. She pulled a suitcase from the top shelf of the closet, the dust motes dancing in the morning light as it hit the floor with a heavy thud. She opened it, the zippers rasping like a warning. She moved methodically, folding only the essentials, ignoring the trinkets and photographs that cluttered the dresser. Her hands brushed against a silver frame, a relic of their early years. She stared at it for a heartbeat, her grip tightening until her knuckles whitened. Then she set it face down on the wood and shoved it aside. She did not pack it. She filled the suitcase, clicked the locks shut, and walked out of the room without a backward glance. The hallway felt longer than usual, the floorboard silent beneath her feet. She reached the front door, her hand hovering over the cold iron handle. She turned it, the latch yielding with a metallic snap, and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The wind caught her hair as she pulled the door shut behind her. She did not lock it. She simply turned away and began the steady, rhythmic walk toward the distant docks, her pace quickening with every step away from the life she had dismantled. The harbor air tasted of salt and diesel. Cami's pace slowed as the asphalt gave way to weathered wooden planks. The sound of the ocean grew from a distant hum to a rhythmic, percussive force hitting the pilings. She stopped at the edge of the pier, scanning the crowded slips. A few boats bobbed in the rising tide, their lines taut against the cleats. Then she saw him. Luca stood by the deck of a sleek vessel, his hand resting on the mast. A surfboard leaned against the hull, its surface scarred by years of waves. He looked up, his gaze meeting hers, and he did not ask questions. He simply gestured to the boat, a silent invitation that cut through the remaining tension in Cami's chest. She walked forward, the wood groaning beneath her boots. The distance between them shrank until she stood close enough to hear the water slapping against the fiberglass. Luca checked the rigging one final time, his movements practiced and calm. before nodding toward the horizon. The mainland behind them felt like a fading memory, a dull weight she was finally ready to drop. She stepped onto the deck, the boat rocking gently under her weight, and felt the first true pull of the tide. Luca cast off the lines, the hemp rope sliding through his calloused hands with a soft hiss. The engine hummed to life, a low vibration that traveled through the deck and into Cami's feet. They moved. The gap between the wooden pier and the fiberglass hull widened, turning the water into a churning wake of white foam. Cami stood at the stern, her eyes locked on the shoreline. Buildings that had defined her world for a decade began to shrink, their sharp edges softening into a jagged, indistinct line against the sky. A thick gray mist rolled off the ocean, hungry and swift, swallowing the docks. Within minutes, the harbor was gone. The mainland dissolved into a featureless haze, leaving nothing but the vast, open horizon ahead. Cami turned away from the vanishing land, facing the bow where the wind whipped past her face. She closed her eyes and inhaled, the air sharp with salt and cold. The weight in her chest, a constant pressure she had carried for years, finally loosened. It did not just fade, it evaporated. She opened her eyes to the endless blue, the realization sinking in with the rhythm of the waves. She was gone. She was untethered. She was finally, completely free. The house felt different with Cami gone. The silence was not empty. It was filled by the sound of Alana moving through the rooms. Jason sat in the living room, his laptop open but ignored, his focus pinned to the doorway. When the phone on the desk buzzed with urgent notifications, he did not reach for it. He watched Alana pour a glass of water, his attention locked on her movements as if they were the only things that mattered. She dropped a spoon. He was across the room before it hit the floor to pick it up. He poured his energy into serving her, turning the living room into a stage where only she existed. Outside, the world continued. But inside these walls, time slowed to the pace of her whims. He stopped checking the calendar. He stopped answering the door for couriers. When she asked for music, he spent 20 minutes adjusting the speakers, his brow furrowed in concentration, desperate to get the sound perfect. He was a man performing for an audience of one, blind to the dust gathering on his desk and the stack of unopened mail accumulating in the hallway. The reality of his life outside this house had ceased to hold any weight. He was entirely, dangerously consumed. The rot started at the edges of his business. Emails piled up by the hundreds, unread and unaddressed, while key contracts expired without a signature. At the office, the lights stayed off in the main hallway. A senior manager knocked on the door of the executive suite, holding a stack of payroll documents that required authorization. Jason did not look up from the kitchen table at home, where he was busy arranging a lunch menu for Alana. He waved the manager away without a word, his gaze fixed on the table settings. Back at the firm, the staff waited in the break room, the silence heavy with the knowledge that their paychecks were overdue. Phones rang incessantly, directed to a voicemail system that had long since reached capacity. Jason ignored the vibration of his phone, letting it slide off the edge of the table to the floor. He did not care about the mounting debt or the legal threats surfacing on his monitor. He had traded his career for the static presence of Alana in his living room. The company was bleeding, the infrastructure failing, but he remained motionless, pouring tea and ensuring the music remained at the exact volume she preferred. His professional life was dissolving into ash, and he was too distracted to notice the fire. Thousands of miles away, the air tasted of salt and constant motion. Cami sat on the warm sand, her hands buried deep in the grit, feeling the steady heat of the afternoon sun. Out in the bay, Luca carved through the surf, his movements rhythmic and precise against the towering blue waves. She watched him, her breathing synchronized with the tide. There was no phone to check, no schedule to maintain, and no voices demanding her attention. She picked up a smooth, white stone, weighed it in her palm, and flicked it into the churning foam. It vanished without a ripple. The silence here was rich, full of the sound of wind and breaking water, a sharp departure from the frantic, suffocating atmosphere she had left behind. While Jason's world fractured under the weight of his own neglect, Cami found her center in the simplicity of the island. She stood up, brushed the sand from her palms, and turned her face toward the horizon. The past no longer dictated her pace. Every action she took now belonged to her alone, detached from the consequences unfolding in the city. She watched the sun dip lower, painting the water in gold, and for the first time in years, she felt the anchor of her own life firmly held in her own hands. Alana moved through the office with a quiet, practiced precision. She did not linger in the hallways or engage with the remaining staff. She went straight to the inner office, pulled the chair to the desk, and opened the primary server access. Her fingers moved across the keyboard in a steady, rhythmic cadence. She bypassed the firewall, redirected the outgoing wire transfers, and verified the routing numbers for the offshore accounts. Every keystroke was calculated. She exported the encryption keys, copied the client database, and cleared the digital footprint of her presence. She did not rush. When a security alert popped up on the secondary monitor, she entered the override code without hesitation, silencing the system before it could ping the IT department. She moved funds in batches, layering them through multiple accounts until the original trail was impossible to trace. By the time the sun began to set, the company accounts were hollow shells. She closed the last tab, locked the screen, and stood up. She walked to the safe, turned the dial until it clicked, and left it slightly ajar. She had cleared the path, leaving nothing but empty folders in a void where the capital used to be. The transition was total. Jason pulled into the underground lot, his key fob echoing against the concrete walls. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt unusually long. When the door slid open, the office did not greet him with the usual hum of cooling fans or the distant chatter of late-night operations. It was dead. He stepped onto the carpet, the sound of his own breathing suddenly prominent in the stillness. He walked past the rows of desks, all dark. No screens glowed, no papers were stacked in their usual piles. He reached the glass partition of the inner office and paused. A prickle of cold sweat broke across his neck, entirely disconnected from the temperature of the room. He reached for the handle of his inner sanctum, but his fingers hesitated for a heartbeat. The air felt thin, pressurized. He pushed the door open, his eyes scanning the space, searching for the familiar warmth of his business world. Instead, he found only shadows stretching across the floor. He stepped inside, his pulse thrumming in his throat, and looked toward the corner where his safe stood. The silence was absolute, a heavy weight pressing against his chest, signaling that the foundation of his life had shifted while he was gone. Jason strode into the server room, his footsteps sharp on the tile. He flipped the light switch, but the room remained dim. The racks of servers, usually humming with a constant cooling vibration, were silent. He walked to the main console, his fingers brushing against the metal casing. It was cold. He tapped the power button, but no status lights flickered to life. He ripped the side panel off the main unit. The drives were gone. The space where the heartbeat of his company resided was hollowed out, nothing but tangled wires and empty bays. He backed away, his breath hitching in his chest. He spun around, moving toward the corner of the office where the floor-to-ceiling safe stood. He stopped 3 paces away. The heavy steel door was not just unlocked, it was swung wide, resting against the wall. He gripped the edge of the door, his knuckles turning white as he stared into the dark, yawning interior. There were no stacks of documents, no ledger books, no backup drives, just a smooth, empty floor of reinforced steel. The weight of the realization hit him, a physical blow that forced him to grip the safe handle for support. The foundation was not just cracked, it had been completely excavated. Jason let go of the heavy safe door. It creaked as it swung a few inches shut, the sound dying instantly in the vacuum of the room. He turned, his movements stiff, and looked at his mahogany desk. A single, crisp, white sheet of paper sat in the exact center of the blotter. He walked over, his boots sounding like gunshots against the floor. He picked up the note. The handwriting was elegant, precise, and entirely devoid of remorse. Every line confirmed the impossible. The offshore transfers, the shell companies, the total liquidation of his assets. Alana had not just taken the money, she had systematically bled his accounts dry over weeks, leaving him with nothing but the debt of his failure. He read the final sentence twice, the ink blurring as the air in the room seemed to vanish. There was no apology. There was no explanation, just a cold confirmation that she had vanished, taking his future with her. He let the paper slip from his fingers. It drifted to the floor, landing face up in the dim light. He looked around the office. the walls suddenly feeling like the interior of a tomb. He was standing in the middle of an empire of shadows, and for the first time he realized the doors were locked from the outside. The silence in the office was absolute. Jason walked to the window, but the city lights below felt miles away, unreachable and indifferent to his ruin. He reached for his phone, thumb hovering over the screen, but his hand stopped. There was no one left to call. His staff had already left, his business partners had cut ties, and his accounts were void. He tapped the desk, the sound hollow and pathetic in the vast, empty room. He had prioritized the flash of Alana's presence over the steady, grounded reality he once held. The memory of the freezing lake surfaced unbidden, the image of Cami pulling him from the dark, biting water. He had been a man saved, given a second chance, and he had treated that life as a disposable convenience. He slumped into his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. The office, once a temple to his ambition, now felt like a prison cell of his own design. He looked at the empty desk, the blank walls, and finally understood the vacancy of his victory. By chasing a shadow, he had discarded the only person who had ever truly anchored him. The realization was colder than the water he had once escaped, and this time, there was no hand reaching out to pull him back to the surface. The sand was warm, retaining the heat of the afternoon long after the sun had begun its descent. Cami sat near the tide line, the salt air drying on her skin. The constant, rhythmic roar of the Pacific provided a backdrop that drowned out every lingering echo of her former life. 100 yards out, Luca carved through a breaking wave, his movements fluid and precise. She watched the water crest and collapse, the white foam swirling around her ankles before receding back into the deep. Cami reached down, her fingers digging into the sand until they touched something firm. She pulled out a smooth, gray stone, perfectly rounded by years of ocean friction. She held it in her palm, feeling the cool, solid weight of it. It was heavy, a dense anchor of memory and obligation that she had carried for a decade. She turned the stone over, feeling the texture of its surface, noting the way it sat in her grip. She held it firmly, then shifted her weight, feeling the sand settle beneath her. The island was quiet, save for the wind and the surf. She was no longer looking for a path back to the mainland. She was simply breathing, holding the weight of her past one last time before deciding what to do with it. Cami tightened her grip on the stone, feeling the jagged edge of a memory that no longer held power. She did not hesitate. With a clean, sweeping motion of her arm, she flung the stone into the surf. It skipped once, twice, then vanished beneath the white-capped water. The sound of the splash was lost almost instantly to the roar of the tide. She stood up, brushing the damp sand from her palms, and felt the tension that had lived in her shoulders for a decade simply dissolve. Ahead, the horizon glowed with the amber light of the setting sun. She stepped forward, leaving the imprint of her feet in the wet sand, moving toward the vast open space of the beach. There was no one waiting for her to arrive, and for the first time, that was exactly what she wanted. She was not a passenger in her own life anymore. She did not need to be pulled from the water or rescued from the shore. She walked steadily toward the light, her gaze fixed on the distance, fully aware that she was the only one who had ever truly held the power to save herself.